You know that as Franciscans we hold everything in common. We share everything. Unfortunately, we also share colds. And so my voice is a little bit lower than it normally is. This year is a very nice year to celebrate the Triduum because later this week our Jewish sisters and brothers will also be celebrating Passover. And those two feasts this year, doesn't happen often, but this year coincide perfectly. And as our sisters and brothers of the Jewish faith come together later this week for the Seder meal, one part of that meal has always impressed me. It's a litany of the great deeds of God, to which everyone continues to respond, Dayenu. It would be sufficient. If the Lord just saved us from slavery, it would have been sufficient. Dayenu. If the Lord saved us from slavery but did not take us out of Egypt, it would be sufficient. Dayenu. If he led us out of Egypt but did not part the sea, it would have been sufficient. Dayenu. If he parted the sea but did not bring us into the wilderness and cared for us, it would have been sufficient. Dayenu. If he led us cared for us in the wilderness but did not give us manna, it would have been sufficient. Dayenu. If he gave us manna but did not lead us to the promised land, it would have been sufficient. Dayenu. I think of that because perhaps we, as we begin this Triduum, need to construct our own litany in which we respond Dayenu, understanding the goodness of God. There's this beautiful, beautiful old Southern hymn. It began about 200 years ago, but it is, what wondrous love is this? What wondrous love is this, O my soul, O my soul? What wondrous love is this? If God simply told us he loved us, that should have been enough. Dayenu. But he sent the prophets and so many holy people in our lives to tell us what God is really like, and that should have been enough. Dayenu. But not only did he give us the prophets, he sent us his Son. And that should have been enough. Dayenu. Not only did he bring us his Son, but that Son became one of us, a human being just like you and I. And that should have been enough. Dayenu. Not only did he become one of us, but he gave us his teaching, his miracles, his example. And that should have been enough. Dayenu. But today we celebrate the feast of the Eucharist, the feast of the Last Supper, in which he gave us his very body and blood to be with us, to strengthen us, to nourish us. And that should have been enough. Dayenu. And as we continue in the Triduum, we learn of his betrayal, his passion, his suffering, his dying, to show us that God's love is so great, there is no place God will not go to be with us. And that should have been enough. Dayenu. And he finally gave us abundant life in the resurrection, not only as the firstborn, but for all of us. And that is definitely enough. Dayenu. If this is that wondrous love that God has shown our world, our community, each and every one of us, how do we respond? It's interesting that as we listen to today's readings, Paul says it's simply enough to eat of the body of Christ and to drink of his blood. And as we enter into the Eucharist, by the very fact that we enter into the Eucharist, we proclaim the death of the Lord. And perhaps that is enough. Dayenu. But John seems to go a little bit further. Just when we're expecting during the Last Supper the institution account, guess what's not there? The institution account. Rather than telling us, this is my body, this is my blood, John has Jesus take off his outer garment, put on an apron, kneel before his disciples, and wash their feet. Perhaps what John is telling us is that as our response to that wondrous love of God, we need to do more. We need to be foot washers. We need to be servants of all we meet. We not only need to wash the probably nice feet that we've washed 2 or 3 times, knowing that we're going to come here and have our feet washed, right? Not only the feet the feet to be washed of one another, but perhaps we're being called to wash the feet, the dirty feet of the poor and the homeless. Perhaps we're being called to wash the feet, the bleeding feet of the migrant and the refugee. Perhaps we're being called to embrace those who so many others have rejected for so many reasons. Perhaps the way we celebrate the love of God, perhaps how we celebrate our Thanksgiving for this Passover that we have begun celebrating tonight, is by being those servants, those foot washers that God has called us to be. And if you're like me, we're not going to do it perfect. We're going to make mistakes. There'll be times in which we're fearful to do what we know we ought to do. There are times in which we bungle things and things don't come out quite the way we want them to be. And that is okay. Because I honestly believe that even our bungling, even our imperfect attempts to thank the Lord by our service to one another, especially to the poor, it is God who will tell us, Dayenu, that's sufficient.